What is going on today? Okay. All right, so this is the lecture over color. It's mostly examples, but there is some history about color in here too, if you haven't gotten that in your previous art courses. So color is a property of light, and we give credit for the color wheel to Isaac Newton, the physicist. He actually came up with the color wheel and discovered the visible spectrum, which is when pure white light passes through a prism and it breaks up into the spectrum. And this is also what we call the rainbow. And we see that all the colors that we see in the spectrum are also arranged in that order on the color wheel that we've probably all seen growing up. Now, when you look at the spectrum, and you can see it here in a diagram and an actual photo of this occurring, notice you don't see any browns, grays, black, or white. And that's because those are technically not colors. Those are what we call achromatic colors, or neutrals. And so whenever we see black, that's when all the color of light is being absorbed. And whenever we see white, that means all the presence of light is there, and that's all reflecting back at us. And then the colors, when they cancel each other out, that's when we see grays and browns and some of the other neutrals. So what does that mean as an artist? Well, that's good for you, because whenever you select a color scheme, if you take a class where you're limited to choose a color scheme and work within it, for instance, like monochromatic, where you only use one color or one hue, you can still use all of those neutrals in the color scheme. So, and it still is part of that color scheme. And we're going to look at some examples of that. Sometimes I have students, they think that they can only use those certain colors, but they forget that they can use the range of values of that color and also use the different neutrals mixed with it as well. So I'm a painter, and I'm obsessed with color. I teach design, and so I really think that there is a close connection to color and our moods and even our physical health. And it's not just me that thinks that. Scientists have done a lot of research over this. There's a whole field called color theory. We actually offer classes in our district for that. I think for interior designers and fashion designers, they're required to take color theory. If you just are curious about it, I would try to take it too, because you really learn a lot. The symbolic history throughout different cultures and religions. It's fascinating. Also, just where the pigment comes from throughout history. It's fascinating. Things that are disgusting, things that are super expensive. At one point, there was a blue that was actually made from semi-precious stones. So the only people that could afford it were people working for really wealthy patrons or the church. And so there's a lot of really cool history surrounding color. If you like that kind of stuff, I have a website here. It's called colormatters.com, and it's like a free online color theory class, but it is like a time vacuum. If you're like me, you'll get on there, and then it will just you'll start discovering all kinds of stuff, and hours will go by, but you'll learn a lot about color. One day I was in my office preparing a lecture, and I was using it as a resource, and this thing popped up and said, "Do you want to know the history of purple?" And I was like, "I think I do." And so I clicked on it, and like 4 hours later, I knew all these facts about purple, and I'd already like missed my time to be home, and it was dark outside and everything. So it's a really cool website though. You'll find things that you wouldn't think of, like why is medicine different colors? How does color affect our taste? Why do they add dyes to our food? Things like that. We can see as many as 10 million different colors. Or most people can, some people can't. There's millions of people across the world that suffer from color blindness. However, a few years ago, like literally within the last 5 years, scientists invented these glasses that are called Chroma, and they allow people that are colorblind to see the full spectrum in most cases. And if you just Google colorblind glasses or go on YouTube and enter it, you'll find a lot of reaction videos of people trying these. So it's kind of cool that they figured out how to do that. But go check out this website if you like color, because I think you'll find stuff. If I go there right now, we'll be here a lot longer than 2 hours. So I'm trying to rush through some of this just to cover what you need to know for this class. These are some of the physical and emotional effects of color, and I'm not going to go through each one, but this is from a medical website. And just like medicine, some medicine makes people hyperactive where it makes other people drowsy. This is more of the general public. So of the people they tested, these are how colors made them feel. So it may be different from person to person. We also associate color with specific memories and childhood memories and things like that. And usually that's where our favorite colors come from. So we look at color from multiple levels. There's the subliminal effect that it has on us. Then there's our personal symbolism and connection to it. And then, of course, our cultural and historical association with those colors and how they play a role in our society. So color is really a complex thing. I know some people, they just don't like certain colors, and if they see artwork that's that color, they just don't like it because it kind of like triggers them in some way. So it's really fascinating when you study color and how it affects people in general. But one thing I wanted you to notice is blue is the most calming color, and they say it even can lower your blood pressure, and it also suppresses your appetite. And so in that website I showed you, the colormatters.com, they actually have an article about, they did a test where they had people put blue lights in their refrigerator or eat off of blue plates, and they actually lost weight but they didn't know. So I bought some blue plates and I actually gained weight because I knew what I was doing and I just ate more food. But normally it should make you lose weight if you don't know what's going on. There's even a blue plate special term that you've probably heard before that dates back to the Great Depression, where diners and restaurants would serve smaller portions on blue plates to save that were cheaper for people, but also a smaller portion so they could afford to stay in business. Green is good for people that have different emotional and mental challenges. It's a lot of psychiatric hospitals and psychologist offices will have green walls because it's supposed to give people a soothing feeling. Pink is also considered to be an appetite suppressant, and it makes us physically weak. And on the contrast to all of those, yellow, orange, and red, they all increase our appetite and they raise our energy. So if you think about all of the fast food restaurants that are out there, most of their advertising is red, yellow, and orange. Even the trays, the paper they wrap your food in, every part of it. Even the additives, if you go to the grocery store, most of our food has yellow and red dye in it to make it look more appetizing. So lots of things to think about. I know this is just a drawing class, but I wanted you to be aware that color is complex. There's a lot going on there. So as an artist, we really have the potential to really manipulate the viewer if we choose to. And sometimes even if we don't choose to, it just happens. So the main thing I want you to get from this class is just like we talked about, we're learning to see. We're learning to see value and not just lines. And so now what I want you to do is to see that color is not simple either. So whenever we're kids, what is our instinct to do? Paint the grass all the same color green, paint the sky all the same color blue, draw a little sun in the sky, a little McDonald's shaped bird flying in the sky. Does that look real? No, right? It doesn't. Sometimes we put the trees right on the edge of the horizon line, like it looks like they're going to jump off the edge of the flat earth. That's not true. So whenever we look at color now, since you're in a college level drawing class, I want you to start looking at color and really think about, what do I see? Like, don't just say, oh, that's a leaf, it's green, and color it all green like a coloring book. No, we need to realize that color is affected by light and all the other things we discussed. So whenever we do that, we realize that color is constantly changing. As the light changes and the days changes and the seasons change, the light is changing as well. And there is a whole movement in art history over that, and it was called Impressionism. And there were two things that led to Impressionism. One was the invention of tube paint. Up until the 1800s, artists had to make their own paint or have their assistants make their own paint. And they were limited to kind of staying indoors because it wasn't something that they could travel with. So all of those paintings before the 1800s of these majestic landscapes and war scenes. Most of that was done from sketches and memory because they still didn't have photography. However, in the mid 1800s, they got photography too. So the photograph was invented, and that also freed artists from having to create exact replications of things. So they were able to go outside, and they weren't required to just sit around painting portraits all day because photography could do that. So what did the artists start doing? They started working in plein air, which means outdoors. And so Monet was one of the first impressionists. And the word impressionism actually came from a insult, a critique. They had an exhibit, and a critic said, "That's not a painting of a sunset. That's an impression of a sunset." And Monet was like, "You know what? I guess I'm an impressionist." And he took that negative shade and he made it into a whole movement that artists still practice today. There are people I know that still call themselves impressionists because they do the same thing. They go outside every day, or they draw their still life by their window, and they do the same thing. They capture light and color. So we're a lot of artists, we look for hidden symbolism and meaning in their work. Monet's symbolism and subject matter really is light and color. And so we often see that Monet painted the same things over and over and over, just to show how the light and color was changing. So it wasn't so much about those objects, but about the light and color. These are two lines of trees, but he painted bales of hay. I think I saw one time at the Kimball, they had an exhibit, and there were like 20 something bales of hay on the wall, like at different times of the day. And it was so beautiful, just someone dedicated to this. I don't really want to do that, but it's cool that someone else wanted to do that. So that's what he did. He also started working so fast because he noticed the light was changing while he was working. And so he would sometimes within an hour, he would have to grab another canvas because it got cloudy, or the light was changing significantly. So color does change. Also, certain colors next to each other can have a visual effect on us. And I wanted you to be aware of that because I'm going to talk about paper choice when we get started on the drawing in just a moment. So here we can see these are little squares of paint that were made by Joseph Albers, who was a color theorist. And he would put different colors on top of other colors to see how they look different. So just like when we talked about value, and I showed you that the value can look different if you don't get them quite right. Remember that value scale that fit from dark to light, and then the middle gray was in the center. The same thing with colors. So notice this pink looks totally different on each of these colors. And so we'll talk about that with the pastels, because believe it or not, if you're using chalk pastels on black paper, they actually look the brightest. And this is not altered. This is all the same in each of these, but because the one on black, it looks brighter. Now, some cases that won't be this way. For instance, if you're using paint and you have like a really thin, watery paint, and you put it on top of black paint, it's going to be transparent. But for most of the really opaque materials that you use, opaque means you can't see through it, you'll see like they'll be brighter on a dark surface. So you may have encountered this before you ever started just painting on a white canvas. You'll probably notice the colors look darker when they dry. Or if you've ever just started drawing on white paper and you're like, wow, this looks a lot darker, this is why. So it's just something to think about as you're working. And then these are just some more of those if you're curious. Now, the word hue, I've been saying that word over and over. Hue basically means color, but we use the word hue just to describe the colors on the color wheel. So all those 12 colors, those are the only hues. And so there's a limited number of hues, but there are millions of colors. So how do we get the other colors? By adding the neutrals to them and mixing them together with each other. And so red, pink, red is a hue, but pink and maroon and all of those are different colors of that hue red. And we do have vocabulary for creating those. So when we add white to a color, we call that a tint. And when we add black to a color, we call that a shade. And so pink is a tint of red, and maroon is a shade of red. All right. And this is where you'll see, like, I have two sisters that are like 10 years younger than me, and one of them is really into like fashion and makeup, and so she's got me hooked into some of that beauty influencer drama that's all over YouTube. And I watch some of those videos just because they do really cool stuff with the makeup, and they have cool challenges and things, but they always use these terms incorrectly, and it scares me for the future of our world when people are using terms like complementary color and tint and shade incorrectly, because it's really educating a lot of people the wrong way. And so I've seen it, like several people are like, look at all of these, you know, shades of pink. And I'm like, there's no shades of pink. Like, pink is a tint. So these terms, like I said, they're universal. So you may hear people use them incorrectly, and that's your job now, is to correct them, right? And so pink is a tint, maroon is a shade, and then we'll talk about some of the other vocabulary now. This is just more showing you how the color can look different on different surfaces. And then this is talking about using color and value. And so purple and yellow are complementary colors. And so if you have just those two colors to work with, you can use purples for the shadows and yellows for the highlights. Even if you photograph it in black and white, those colors, yellow is going to look lighter and purple is going to look darker. And so that's why I'm giving you that one sketchbook assignment, is to create value studies without using black charcoal or your black pastel, because I want you to learn to create values by using color, and it can be done. That brings us up, I know I've been talking about photographing or turning your work upside down and looking at it from a different angle. Another tip that I love to do whenever I'm working is, if something I just can't figure out what it needs or what's wrong with it, I will take a black and white photo of it, because that will allow me to see the other elements more clearly. And a lot of times we keep adding color, but we don't think about value, we don't think about shape, we don't think about line. And so whenever you photograph your work in black and white, you may see, oh wow, it's off balance, or oh wow, I need some more contrast, or maybe there's too much contrast. So that's another little trick, is turn it multiple sides and look at it. But also, you know, if you have a smartphone, you can probably take a black and white photo and see how it looks that way. Intensity and chroma, that has to do with like how saturated the color is. Most of your pastels are going to be pretty saturated, so they probably will have to be toned down depending on what color that you're trying to recreate. So just like paint, you mix them together, and the more colors you mix together, the less chromatic they are. And then here we have the basic color wheel. And I know I've made a few pop culture references, but since I've been off, I've been watching a lot of YouTube videos. I just kind of have it playing all the time while I'm drawing and grading and everything else. And I've really been surprised. A lot of the recent music videos have had some pretty standard color schemes. Like, I think I saw one of Lady Gaga's videos that came out. It had like all analogous colors in it. And then I can't remember all their names now, but there's been a lot. I think Dua Lipa, most of her videos, it's almost like a class assignment, the way that she uses the color schemes in her music videos. So you'll see this in other areas, and it may make more sense to you now why they do certain things in other visual fields. So this is the basic color wheel. Primary colors are yellow, red, and blue, and those create all the other colors on the color wheel. So that's why we call them the primary colors. And they also are a color scheme by themselves as well. And then yellow and red mix to make orange, and then red and blue make purple, and then blue and yellow make green. And so those are what we call the secondary colors, green, orange, and purple. And then those colors between the primary and secondary are made by mixing those two together. And those are what we call the tertiary or the intermediate colors. And they do not have their own unique name. their name is the primary color, a hyphen, and then the secondary color. So this would be yellow-green, blue-green, blue-violet, red-violet, red-orange, and yellow-orange. So you always put the primary color and then the secondary color. And you probably remember having crayons that are those colors. Now, I've been saying the word complementary. Complementary means colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel. So if you notice, red and green are right across from each other. And if you mix those together, guess what happens? You get brown. And the same thing for purple and yellow. You get kind of like a yellow ochre looking brown. If you mix red, blue and orange, you get like a raw sienna looking brown. If you mix blue violet and yellow orange, you'll get a brown. So all the complementary colors, we call them complements because they do have a lot of contrast between each other, but they also, when they're mixed together, they create the neutrals. Now, if you were like me as a kid, I didn't have any artistic training and we didn't even have cable, but sometimes when I'd spend the night with friends, I would see them watching Bob Ross. And he would be like, let's mix some yellow and some blue and make a happy green and paint some happy trees. And then I would get home and I'd be like, okay, I think I remember what he did. And I would find like whatever craft paint I could find in the house or house paint out in the barn. And I would try it and my green would look like throw up. And then I would add more blue and it would look more blue throw up. And I'd add more yellow and it would look even worse. And so then I would paint some trees and they would look really sad and not happy. And I just thought, wow, Bob Ross has some mad skills. I don't even know what I'm doing. But what I didn't realize is that when we look at the color, the spectrum, it's not separated like this in the color wheel. It's continuous. And so this area that we call yellow, there's a lot of different yellows in there. And in this area we call blue, there's a lot of different blues. So there's going to be a blue that's closer to this blue violet, and there's going to be a blue that's closer to this blue green. And the same thing with red. There's going to be a red closer to red orange, and red that's closer to red violet. So whenever we see people like Bob Ross painting on TV, they have a really strong understanding of which color goes where. So if they want to make a green that looks like this, they know to mix lemon yellow and phthalo blue, because that will give you that true green that also will make like turquoises and things like that. They know if they want to make like a darker like forest green, they can use a cadmium yellow, which would be over here, and then a ultramarine blue that's closer to the violet, which will make a darker, kind of more neutral looking green, like a camo green almost. And so if you take a painting class, you learn a lot more of that. I really get into color quite a bit in my painting class. And I know I'm talking a lot. I'm sorry, I told you I get really excited about color. So color can also be separated into warm and cool. Basically, the colors that look like fire are warm and they tend to expand and come towards us, where cool colors contract and recede into the distance. And so this is a really cool technique to use when you're drawing, is to create sense of depth, putting warm colors in the foreground or areas that are highlighted and cool colors in the shadows or areas further away. You can really create a sense of depth in your work. And those are just some more swatches showing you how color can affect. So here you see a lot of those color schemes that I've been talking about illustrated, and these are the same. Like I've had people tell me like, oh, look at this complementary color of blue and purple because they look good together. That's not a complementary color scheme, okay? The complementary colors, they're always across from each other. Analogous, they're always side by side. So they're adjacent or neighbors to each other, and it can be any colors that are side by side. The secondary colors are always purple, green, and orange, and the primary colors are always red, blue, and yellow. And you can't just use two of those. So like I've had students before just use red and blue, and they're like, oh, I use the primary colors. That's not a primary color scheme though, because you do need to use all of them, okay? And then monochromatic means using one color. Mono means singular, and chroma means color or hue. And so I really like monochromatic color schemes because they tend to give you just one mood. And then here I have some artwork throughout history just to kind of show you that some of the most famous artists you know, they also worked in color schemes. So here's Picasso. This is from uh, his early movement. They call his blue period. I don't think he ever called it that, but art historians do. But this is when he had just left Spain and traveled with the best friend to Paris to try to make it as an older teenager and become an artist, because Paris was kind of like New York or LA in Europe, and that's where artists would go to be discovered. But when he first moved there, his best friend that he traveled with committed suicide, and Picasso was there isolated and alone, and nobody knew who he was at that time. And so he really struggled to make a living. He found himself on the street panhandling his art, just like musicians were, and he really connected with the people on the street and the other people in similar harsh situations like him, and he painted them quite often. And he used primarily a um, blue color scheme, using just one color and different values of it. And you can see, although this is kind of sad and they feel cold and lonely, blue is also the color of spirituality. And I think whenever we struggle, that's when we connect to our faith and our hope. And that's what, makes us kind of discover who we are and to make the most of what we have. And where we realize that what's limiting us is really forcing us to find our limitless potential. And you see that with musicians, with visual artists, like they tend to make their best work when they're going through, something maybe heart-wrenching or more challenging. And so I really connect a lot with Picasso's early work, more so than some of his later work, because I just feel like it was more honest and he was more vulnerable in that work. So whenever we use color schemes, like a primary color scheme of red, yellow, and blue, they don't have to be used in the same quantity. And so that's where a lot of students get confused. They think they have to use the same amount of each color, but that's not true. So here in this portrait on the left, you see the majority of it is yellow, but then the blue and the red are used for mid values and the darker shadows. Same thing with this portrait of I think it's the Beatles here. You can see just minimal, more blue than any of the other colors. I don't see the secondary color used as often. I don't know. To me, it always makes me think of Halloween for some reason, but I'm not really big on the color orange for some reason. But here we see the purple, green, and orange colors used together. And then here's an example of complementary color scheme with orange and blue. You've probably all seen this self-portrait by Van Gogh. This was the last one that he completed before his passing. And you can see that there are all these muted blues that were tinted with white. But then that really makes his head the focal point because he used all these fiery oranges that are really chromatic. So that's one way you can create a focal point, is to mute one complement and then really use the other one in its true, like as bright as possible in its true chroma, and that will really grab the viewer's attention. And sadly for Van Gogh, this was, I think, a cry for help. With a lot of his self-portraits, it's like he's looking in the mirror, wondering, how he can feel better, what's going on with him. I can't imagine what the healthcare for patients that struggled with different mental problems back then, what it was like. And he was in and out of asylums a lot of times by his own choice to try to get help for some of the stuff that he was going through. So to me, it's really heartbreaking to see that kind of conflict from the outside world to with just the idea of complementary colors. Here's an analogous color scheme. So those are using colors side by side on the color wheel. And this is the warm side. And then here's using the cooler side, the greens and yellow greens and blue greens. And when I was talking about local color earlier, this is more of what I was talking about. I love Frida Kahlo's work, and I think she was a wonderful artist and very true to herself. However, her color usage was pretty, simple. She used the colors that you associate with those objects and would just create, pretty simple value ranges for them. She wasn't really experimenting a lot with using other colors. And so sometimes you'll see in her work, even though it's beautiful and I wouldn't change anything, I'm not judging Frida, but do you see how sometimes like the objects almost look like they've been copied and pasted in, even though it was all did. And so whenever you start to really have colors reflecting off of each other and things like that, that's what will create a more believable sense of space. And we can see that in a work like this, where we see a really complex use of color. And this is more of a sort of modern take on pointillism by Chuck Close. Chuck Close was a hyper-realist painter that has become ill over time. So now he has face blindness where he can't recognize people, and he also can barely move his arms. And so he can only paint these circles. And instead of stopping painting, he now has his assistants tape his paintbrushes to his wrist, and he gets up on this lift and it lifts him up and down, and on these huge canvases he paints these little donut circles, and you can see here up close of the lips, and then from a distance it still looks pretty lifelike. And so you can see from this to this, you can see how this one looks kind of closer to maybe something that could be paint by number or coloring book, where this looks like, you wouldn't know really where to start. And so that's what I mean by kind of an advanced use of color. And you may see artists using strange colors in places that aren't natural, and being a little more experimental with color. And with students, I always say that if you're scared to do that, or you tried it before and it doesn't look right, start out with the more natural colors, or limit yourself to maybe a color scheme, and then start adding in colors on top of that until you feel comfortable. And the more work you make, the better you'll get at it. So I hear a lot of students, they're like, well, this teacher told me to never use black, and this teacher told me if I use black, I have to make it myself for mixing other colors together. And I remember I had a professor once who told me that I didn't know how to use color correctly. And then I went to an art history class right after that painting class, and that art history class, the teacher gave a lecture over an artist that defecated in cans, and that was his art. And so I remember just thinking, as a student, I was so confused. I was like, how can my painting teacher tell me that I don't know how to use color, but then another artist is basically using human excrement as art, like, and that color is okay? Like, I don't get it. And so it's really hard. Like, a lot of these rules or guidelines that we may have as a student, you may see them rebelled against in the art world. And that's just something you have to stay true to yourself. But you also have to realize, am I in a class? Do I have guidelines? And then when are you not in a class, and what is acceptable, then. So you want to make sure that you're happy with your work and that it serves its purpose, whether it's an assignment or something you're doing for yourself or a client. And then, does it have the right amount of, unity and variety? And then I think I've already said most of that. So you want to have fun. Don't be scared, okay? So for your color assignments, you're going to be allowed to do one of two things, or both if you feel like it. So you can choose a master assignment in color, and I would like you, if you choose to do this option, I would like you to email it to me, just kind of for the thumbs up. And then you don't have to draw the whole thing. You can zoom in and crop, just like we did with the self-portrait and with the still life. So this was a demo I did of this piece where I just focused on the woman's head, and I enlarged it with pastels. And then these are some of the student examples, and you can see some of these they look just like the original. And these were all drawing one student. So if you're like, I don't think I can do that, I promise you can. Now, sometimes students will choose some that are more, they have, like, I've had students before choose like Van Gogh's Starry Night. You can see one here, and they're like, oh, I don't have to draw all those lines. And I'm like, yeah, you do. If it's a master study, you've got to master their technique. So you may find if you choose a more impressionistic piece that's got certain lines or marks, I do expect you to try to replicate that. So obviously this one, the pastels were blended to create this hyper-realist look. But in other cases, the artist left it scumbled or loose because that was the style that they worked in. So whatever you choose, you'll have to try to mimic not only their use of color, but also their technique of mark making as well. So just keep that in mind. And usually students are really happy with these. The reason that I want to approve it is because all of these are ones that most people with a general knowledge of art, they would recognize. And so I don't want you to choose something that maybe is more current, or that that maybe they're not as famous, that people may think that you copied them and that you're taking credit for it. I don't want you to get in trouble. So usually with master studies, it's safest to do a master study of an artist that has passed and that their work's been widely celebrated. And then, of course, in the title, if you post it anywhere, you would want to allude or give credit. Sometimes people will call it like an ode to the artist, or call it master study or whatever. So you just don't want people to think that you're copying someone else and trying to put off your work as you being the original artist. But this one here, the third class carriage, this piece, it was so well done. Whenever I was grading these at the college before we closed down, it was 18 by 24, and I had it laid on this counter, and another professor walked by and was like, oh, where did you find a poster of that masterpiece? I've always wanted that for my office. And I was like, oh, that's a drawing one student's drawing, that's not a poster. And the teacher was just like, whoa. And so that was a really cool moment that the student even tricked an art history teacher. So I thought that was kind of fun. And then the second assignment we're going to do is, of course, the fruit study, or if you choose to do the fruit study instead. And I want you to just create a still life with at least 2 or 3 different color objects. I like to use fruit just because the color's not super plasticky looking, so you get a nice range. Where sometimes if you're drawing things like, let's say they were little McDonald's toys or something, that they may be so flat in color that you may not get enough range, that your drawing may look too flat if you don't have a lot of experience doing that. So real fruit works great for drawing. And then these are some student examples. And you can throw in other objects too if you want. Normally, if we were in a face-to-face class, I have 2 pear trees in my backyard. And so normally I'll bring in a bunch of pears, and then I put other colored objects like bottles and glass and things, and set up a still life that people can view from more than one angle. But all of these were drawing one students. And what I wanted you to see is, do you notice how, like here on the bottom left-hand corner, you can kind of see the green of this pear sort of reflecting in the shadow of this orange. And you can see the pear reflecting in this bottle here. And the same thing in this bottle on the right side. You see some of these things, and whether the students knew what that was or not, they saw that color there and they put it there. And so you can see by paying closer attention, you realize that it's not just, oh, I'm going to color this all brown, because that's not really how we see. All right, so hopefully that will help you. And that is the color